commemorating their battles against the system, and so it's a good day to think about this. Yesterday we had a great day. I encourage you all to go into the Twitter, and there's a link of a summary Glenn made, an ebook. It was a collaborative effort, and it summarizes yesterday's presentations. Thank you, Glenn. Thank you, everybody, for that work. Today we have a treat. Before we start, I want to take the opportunity to welcome. Yesterday we didn't recognize Marilyn Kate. She got here in the afternoon. She's going to be a speaker later on today. And we have this morning Dr. Milton Mueller. I'm a fan of Dr. Milton Mueller. He's one of the leading thinkers and writers on internet governance, on these new sui generis institutions like ICANN, which you really can't describe very well from an international law point of view, but they work. I personally thought things like ICANN were a big lie before I started to learn about it. I thought it was pure ritual. What I think now is a ritual that has a good purpose, which is, because ITU is pure ritual too, but with little, in my view, little added value usually. But I think ICANN and things like ICANN, but I don't think there's anything quite like ICANN. The multi-stakeholder environment that it supports and promotes really is a counter view of how to be able to do things in the international sphere in which states are not the only stakeholders. We learned yesterday in Olivier's presentation mostly, and also in Judith's, the tension between multilateralism and multi-stakeholderism, and how in many ways, even though Olivier spoke in positive terms about the ITU, but in many ways these old, a bit sclerotic, highly formal institutions like the ITU, in which states are the stakeholders, and they maybe open some spaces of participation by others, like the IDF, versus highly informal things like ICANN that have processes and have formalities, but permit things like I learned about it, and then I was able to voice my opinion against people that know a lot more than I do, people that know less, people that are highly qualified, people that are okay. But then that hodgepodge of things moves a process that ends up with, in my view, positive outcomes. So Dr. Mueller is a professor at the Georgia Institute of Technology, School of Public Policy. His teaching and research focuses on the political economy of communication and information. He is the director of the Internet Governance Project and the author of 3 seminal books of internet governance: Ruling the Root, which I've read, Networks and States, which I'm reading, and Will the Internet Fragment, which I haven't bought. Currently, he is doing research on digital trade policy, cybersecurity, and internet governance, the security governance practices of ISPs, and the IPv6 transition. As a co-founder of ICANN's non-commercial users constituency, he has played a leading role in organizing and mobilizing civil society and ICANN in the Internet Governance Forum and OECD. From 1998 to 2015, he was professor at the Syracuse University's School of Information Studies. He has a PhD from the University of Pennsylvania's Annenberg School in 1989. Please a hand for Dr. Mueller. Let's see, should I use this?
You turn off the podium on here, it'll be back.
It'll be back.
Yeah, that's much.
Hello. That's very close.
Good. Okay. And
let's bring up my slides.
See if I can find it.
Yeah.
Yours is,
Okay, here.
yeah, where's that look? The bones of there.
So, yes.
Yeah. Oops. Yeah. Oh, there it is.
Okay. All right, everybody, thank you for inviting me. I'm really happy to be in Puerto Rico again. We are all impressed with the organization of this school, and I really have no idea how many of you, what kind of background you have. I've told that it's diverse. So I'm going to try to talk about big issues, and I encourage you at any moment, if you don't understand what I'm saying, or if you have a question in your mind about what I'm saying, then you are welcome to raise your hand and stop me, and we will try to deal with your questions as we go along. So this thing doesn't work.
Should work.
Yeah, it's all right. Let's just use the good old-fashioned arrow key. That doesn't work either. There we go. So this is indeed, well, it's funny. So what I'm seeing here on this resume slideshow.
The owner of the computer is with us right now.
Okay.
I don't know how we set it up. So, there you go.
Okay, right.
But it should work. It's not working. Yeah, so you'll have to sí, pero se supone que sea este. Aquí. Sí, como sí.
All right, good.
Okay.
Okay, so yes, we sort of specialize in internet governance at Georgia Tech. We have a project there. It's been going for more than 10 years now. And we have been focusing on various aspects of internet governance for some time. This is my latest book, and some of the things I'll be talking about here today about cybersecurity are drawn from that book, because I will be trying to emphasize the geopolitical environment of cybersecurity and not talking about it so much in technical terms. Now, here's something that if you're interested in internet governance and if you're involved in the internet governance environment, this is something that should interest you. So if you look at the Google search terms, they have this wonderful thing called Google Trends, where you can track how many times things have been searched for. So if you compare the number of times people search for the terms internet governance, that's the little red line there, down at the bottom. And as you can see, it almost looks like it's flatlining, that doesn't have a pulse anymore. You can see a bit of a peak there around the time of the first Internet Governance Forum in 2006. But if you look at cybersecurity, how many times do people search for that? You see that it has always exceeded Internet governance. But recently it's been very much on an uptrend, and we all know why, right? We all know why. And incidentally, that blip in the middle, what the heck is that doing there? How many of you know what that is? It's October 2009. So what happened then, that there was a piece of malware called Cybersecurity, and it was one of those things that popped up on your screen and said, you might have a virus, install this software, and it was actually malware. And so what everybody was searching for in October of 2009 was, how do I get rid of the cybersecurity malware? So that was the peak of cybersecurity searching in terms of search words. Leave that in there to show you how glitchy this thing can be. But in general, the whole, my point here is that the whole environment of internet governance discourse has been, in a sense, taken over by concerns about cybersecurity. And legitimately so, because, you know, it's so fundamental. If you can bring down a system, if you can take over a system, if you can bring down a country, although I think those are exaggerated concerns sometimes, but if indeed you can bring down a country by fiddling with cyber systems, then this becomes a little important. So, one of the things I'm going to tell you about is that the world of cybersecurity kind of stems from different roots from the world of internet governance. And one of the concepts to begin with is when we talk about cybersecurity, we're talking about the security of cyberspace. And is cyberspace and the internet the same thing? Now, this is actually kind of an ongoing debate. So the most famous definition of cyberspace, at least the one that's most repeated in my circle, maybe not in yours, comes from the US Joint Chiefs of Staff, and it basically defines cyberspace as sort of the collection of all kinds of electronic devices and networks and embedded devices. And so it makes it sound like cyberspace is just sort of a collection of information technologies. But there's something wrong with that definition. It is connectivity that transforms those information infrastructures into a world, a space, a domain that you can move around in, that you can navigate. And where does that connectivity come from? It comes from TCP/IP. It comes from the internet. Before there was the internet, information security was a thing. People talked about it. It was an important thing. But the internet totally transformed the cybersecurity problem because everybody in the bloody world was connected. That meant that somebody in the Czech Republic could, in principle, access your corporate network in Madagascar. You know, as long as there's internet connectivity. So the internet and the World Wide Web made all the world's networks and data globally compatible. And that's why the cybersecurity problem became something that was unprecedented and unusually interesting for the world. Now, as I said, the concerns about cybersecurity, particularly in the last 10 years, going back to about 2008, even before that in some senses, but they didn't really start to intersect until about 10 years ago. I call it a tale of two frames. It's how do you look at this problem? Do you look at it as an internet governance problem? Or do you look at it as a separate kind of a cybersecurity governance problem? Now, the reason this is significant, just hop up here, right? Do this in one word. Is that the internet governance people like me and Marilyn Cade and the people who formed ICANN, we came from sort of a non-state actor-dominated community. We came from an environment in which state actors and non-state actors were equal. Indeed, maybe the situation, as the GAC is always complaining, is a little bit biased towards the non-state actors. We were always concerned about minimizing fragmentation and territorial jurisdiction. We wanted to keep the internet global and connected. Now, if you look at the cybersecurity people, they frequently had a different perspective. Many of them were coming from military organizations, from military governance. they tended to see security of the computer systems as an issue of national security, not just cybersecurity. And those two are not the same thing, and I'll be talking about that. And of course, to those people, the primary actor was the national government and not sort of this global multi-stakeholder community. So I make a distinction that when we talk about cybersecurity, I want to make a very important distinction, and that is between what we call societal cybersecurity and national cybersecurity. So what's the distinction? Again, for societal cybersecurity, security has to be as global as possible. It doesn't matter whether your computer is in Saudi Arabia or the United States. If it is insecure, it can become part of a botnet that affects anybody in the world. So we emphasize the global nature of cybersecurity. The relevant units of security, that is, who are we trying to secure or what are we trying to secure? In our perspective, the units are the individual user and or the organizations that are part of cyberspace. In this worldview, most of the responsibility for security lies with private actors, because those are the people who are operating, owning, and running the networks. Now, of course, governments have networks too, but insofar as they're responsible for their own networks, they're not necessarily responsible for our networks or our computers. And in general, cybersecurity in this sense is a positive-sum game, that if you become more secure, we all become a bit more secure because there's less externalities, fewer problems in the internet as a whole. Now this is all, and then in general, what is the role of the state? Well, it's fundamentally one of law enforcement, of prosecuting and deterring criminal actors. Now, if you think of cybersecurity as a national problem, you have a very different perspective. You think of cyberspace as being divided up into national territories. We're very familiar with how China and Russia tend to view cyberspace this way. Russia is fond of referring to cyberspace, or their own cyberspace, or the national segment. And we know that China wants to assert sovereignty over its own cyberspace. But the US, people within the US military frequently also refer to cyberspace as a national asset, or as something that, we have to defend our cyberspace, as if it were, divided up into national segments. To this perspective, the relevant unit of security is not the individual user or the organization, but the nation. So when we achieve security, we achieve it nationally as a collective entity. Fish this out of my pocket. And in this view, the ultimate responsibility for security lies with the government, which is sort of normally the way things do with military security, right? Or even with police security, the responsibility lies with the government. Now, a very important and interesting difference here is that in geopolitics, security is a zero-sum game. It's not a positive-sum game most of the time. By that I mean, and we'll talk about this further down the line, if, let's say, the United States becomes stronger in terms of cyber power, it necessarily means that the other states are weaker, right? It's just like with military power. If I'm stronger, I'm more of a threat to you. And that's just the way things work in geopolitics. It's kind of a zero-sum game. And finally, it's more of a military model as opposed to a civil law model, because there is, among the world states, there is no uniform sense of criminal law, although we do have some cooperation and treaties. So the main threats to security in this model come from other states, right? Because we're all in a Hobbesian anarchic world at the international level. Okay, so this is some pretty heavy stuff. Are there any questions or any comments from you at this point, or am I completely losing you? Oh, it's a quiet bunch. All right. So what do we mean when we talk about cyberspace? Let's go back to that question for a minute. One way to look at internet territory, if you will, is to look at it as a collection of autonomous systems. Do we know what ASs are, autonomous systems? That's the basic unit, the basic network unit. The internet is a network of networks. It's a protocol for connecting a bunch of different networks in a very open way. And to join the internet, you basically register an autonomous system number, and you get some IP addresses, and you route your packets to other ASs based on their IP addresses. So, but there's something wrong with this map in that we are still looking at it as a two-dimensional space with boundaries that are sort of like the boundaries of, let's say, a map, right? And that's not quite right. This is probably a better understanding of territory in cyberspace. It's a relational situation. So those large gold dots, those are large internet service providers. The orange ones are small internet service providers. The hollow circles are internet exchange points. And what we have in terms of the territory here is actually a series of interconnections among nodes. That's the kind of space that we're talking about in cyberspace. That contrasts very much with the whole notion of territorial sovereignty among governments, right? The whole point of sovereignty is that within this geographical space, one authority is supreme. That's fundamentally what sovereignty means. We are the government. We are the legitimate controller of violence and force within that territory. And where that boundary of my government ends, let's say this little green line here is country A and that's country B. I have supreme authority here, and if I'm the TAN government, I have supreme authority here. And if we want to do anything, we have to negotiate or work something out, or maybe fight a war or two. So territorial sovereignty is, the world is totally fragmented into 200 pieces. So you've probably heard about this fragmentation debate in internet governments, right? So I'm trying to abolish the fragmentation, or as I call it, the F word. I want to replace it with a different word, which I call alignment. And what I mean by alignment is that you are trying to force cyberspace, this relational, non-territorial space, into the boundaries of the territorial nation state. So everybody get that? You see the guy here is a nice cartoon. He's pounding a round peg into a square hole. You can sort of glean my opinion about the situation from that. But that's kind of what's happening right now. And why? How is this related to cybersecurity? Well, it's related to cybersecurity because cybersecurity is one of the key forces leading to this nationalization or alignment of the internet. So, what I call national securitization, I apologize, that slide is not as readable as it should be. Essentially, you reconceive cyberspace as a as a military domain. You nationalize and centralize threat intelligence and incident response. So instead of having global or transnational forms of institutions like the RIRs or ICANN, you have a national CERT, or a national computer security incident response team. You have a national program of information sharing like the US Department of Homeland Security just set up under the CISA Act. You might even start getting national technical standards. Maybe we should have our own encryption standard, our good old American red, white, and blue encryption standard, because we don't want those Russians to be able to break into our systems, right? Maybe you should have national ownership restrictions, because if somebody from a foreign country owns a piece of information technology, you probably can't trust it, right? Procurement. Foreign direct investment. How many of you have been watching the battle in the United States about Qualcomm? Qualcomm, right? So what's going on with Qualcomm? And who's trying to buy it? Broadcom. So where is Broadcom headquartered? What's it?
Don't know, China?
No, it's not. It's Singapore. And we all know that Singapore is a massive military threat to the United States. They might invade it anyway. No, I'm being a little too flip here, but so what's the deal with Broadcom trying to take over Qualcomm? Well, just as you indicated, China looms large in this equation because the US military and national security interests really, really, really like Qualcomm because they are a trusted supplier of information technology components to the US military, and they also are a highly innovative, technically an innovative company, and they are developing 5G technologies. And we are perceived by many people as being in a race with China to create technological preeminence in 5G, artificial intelligence, other agencies. So instead of this being a market competition that takes place on a global level, the national security domain tends to view this as a national competition in which Qualcomm is, you know, the flag carrier for the US, and Huawei and other Chinese companies are the flag carriers for our rival. Now, in some ways, this is completely unrealistic. Because if you look at where Qualcomm gets its revenue, maybe about 60% of that money is coming from license uses in China. China is a big, big, big market. Lots of people there, over 1 billion, and they're starting to become wealthier and they're buying things. So in some sense, this whole thing is a fiction that this is a US company, and the same thing the other way around. If you look at Huawei, the Chinese equipment manufacturer, yeah, they're selling a lot of stuff in China, but they've also become globally competitive and they wanted to enter the American market. But they have been blocked, just as China blocks all kinds of American information services companies. And so we have a problem, Houston. You can see how this problem of alignment, of trying to fit cyberspace into the mold of nation-state problems and nation-state control and nation-state competition is working at cross purposes to the nature of the internet as a globally interconnected system in which we can have globally integrated markets, we can have connections among everybody. This is a serious issue. And cybersecurity, you know, it's not a lie. There are problems. Governments do spy on each other. The Chinese break into our systems. We're certainly breaking into Chinese systems. The Russians are doing all kinds of interesting things that we'll talk about. And I'm sure we're doing interesting things to the Russians. So, as I say, cybersecurity is not just about the mundane technical issue of whether a cyber criminal can break into your system and steal your identity and then go on a credit card buying spree, although that's important, but it's also getting linked into geopolitics. Now, there's other ways of alignment, such as a territorialization of information flows. So you can see that happening with the way some countries try to create international gateways through which they block access and filter access to internet's content around the world. Data localization laws, in which they say if you want to offer a cloud service in Germany, you have to have your server in Germany. I'm just using that as an example. I don't know if Germany actually has such a law. I don't think they do, at least not yet. Geo-blocking, all kinds of issues about trying to territorialize the global internet. And one of the most interesting and less well understood aspects of this, and probably one of the least threatening aspects of this, is the so-called alignment of critical internet resources. Now, I say this is less threatening not because it wouldn't be a big threat, but because we have created ICANNs and RIRs and transnational institutions to handle names and numbers, it's very hard to put the genie back in the bottle. We've already broken out of the nation-state model when it comes to ICANN, and so there's less of a danger there. But just to give you an idea, there was a Chinese DNS proposal in 2012 in which they said, hey, what's with this global namespace business? Why don't we have every country have their own DNS route? And so there'd be a US route, and the US would decide what domain names exist in the US route, and there'd be a Chinese route, and the Chinese government would decide what goes into the Chinese domain name system. So for example, google.cn would be allocated by the Chinese government, not by some global entity like VeriSign that gives you google.com that works everywhere in the world. That's a bad idea if you're a nationalist, because that kind of bypasses the national government, right? And who wants that? Except for some crazy anarchistic guys like Milton Mueller. So they actually put before the Internet Engineering Task Force an RFC that said, let's have this nationally partitioned domain name space. Now, how many of you think that the IETF welcomed this idea and passed this standard? No, so you're all laughing, so you understand that this got nowhere. But again, why did this get nowhere? It was because we had an organically developed internet institution that was not beholden to state actors. It was private sector based, it was based in the technical community, and the technical community doesn't value this kind of nationalistic approach. At least most of them don't now. So that got nowhere. Here's some other examples. So I've already mentioned Huawei. There's really no evidence that the equipment that Huawei sells to foreign countries is part of a gigantic Chinese spying plot. But then the NSA in the US probably fears that it could be, and the reason they know that it could be is because they spend a lot of time intercepting Cisco routers and doing nasty things to them so that they could be used to spy on people in other countries. So it sort of takes one to know one, right? I think the same thing is going on with Kaspersky. This is a really unfortunate thing going on here. It's currently before the courts in the US, and you can read a lot of interesting debates going on between the Department of Homeland Security and the defenders, the lawyers defending Kaspersky. So essentially Kaspersky has been tarred as a tool of Russian espionage. And so we actually put into our National Defense Authorization Act a particular sentence saying, "Thou shalt not use Kaspersky software." which is very strange, you know, to have a particular company singled out like that. So they're not saying like a general rule, thou shalt not use insecure systems, or thou shalt not use, you know, any kind of foreign software. Now, this is hugely damaging to Kaspersky because they, again, the Russian market is not really that big, and they want to position themselves as a global company, and Kaspersky indeed has global competitiveness and expertise. I'm not particularly defending them in this case. In other words, to me, this issue is not about whether you like Kaspersky or not. The issue is, are we creating an environment in which the national origin of the person who makes a piece of software or a network or a piece of equipment is more important than its functionality because of security considerations? I think that's a tremendously important problem that the internet is facing, that internet governance is facing. And you see the same thing with China and cloud services. So essentially the American highly competitive, highly excellent cloud providers like Amazon and Apple have fundamentally been driven out of the Chinese market because the government doesn't want to allow them to function there. They want to be in control. Now, is this simple trade protectionism? Is this sort of national protectionism, or is it national security concerns? Well, that's kind of the problem, is that you never know. We claim all kinds of things are for national security. President Trump has just declared that aluminum and steel tariffs against the Canadians and the Europeans, as well as the Chinese, are necessary for national security, right? Now, in this case, it's pretty obvious, and it's obvious in the Chinese case, too, that this is more about protectionism than it is about national security. But if a government is in position, you know, national security is like a, if you'll pardon the expression, a trump card that you can throw down on the table and win an argument in many contexts whenever you want. Because if it's about national security, then it's about existential life or death questions, right? Who's going to say, nah, we don't need so much national security? Try winning an argument in Washington with that. Okay. Let me just get a drink. So that's the sort of big overview geopolitical hoopla that I want to alert you to. How much time do I have left? I have no idea.
Keep going.
What's that?
20 minutes.
Keep going. Okay. Well, now I'm going to get a little bit boring and pedantic, so maybe you'll ask me to stop in a few minutes. But now we'll talk more in conceptual terms about what information security is and what kinds of issues are going on in a more low-level technical sense in cybersecurity. So this is a useful conceptual framework for understanding information security. This is a well-known framework. We can divide information security into three different kinds of problems. One is the problem of confidentiality. That is, are you exposing information about yourself or the person you're communicating with to an unauthorized party? Some of you might call that privacy, but confidentiality is actually a more accurate term in a technical sense, because privacy has a lot of social and personal implications. So confidentiality is the C. Integrity, what does that mean? That means, is the data modified or corrupted by somebody in an unauthorized fashion? So for example, if I can break into your website and put an advertisement for of my face on Marilyn Cade's website, then that would be a horrible crime, and it would be very devastating to poor Marilyn. But that would be an integrity problem. That would be me manipulating the data. I hate to say corrupting. If it's a picture of me, I mean, that would That would not be corrupt at all. But,
It would definitely enhance it.
I didn't want to say that, but you did. So, but another example of that would be just going into somebody's files and deleting them or something. So you're messing with the integrity of the data. And so what availability means that you are attacking the uptime of the service, like you are preventing somebody from operating in effect. So those that's a useful framework for thinking about cybersecurity or information security. The other thing, when you're thinking about, this is something I encourage my students to do, is you have to have an adversarial mindset, right? And what does that mean? That means, you know, probably you've been encouraged throughout this school to think of the internet as a cooperative thing where we all try to get along, we try to work together to make things better. Okay, cybersecurity is the opposite of that. You start thinking about, how can I break into something? How can I mess this up? How can I manipulate it in ways that were unintended? So you have to be kind of, have an evil part of your brain to be a good cybersecurity person, and you think, okay, if I was an attacker, if I was trying to attack you, what could I do? And obviously that's not a totally antisocial way of thinking about things, because there are bad people out there. So if you're not thinking about how your systems or how even your buildings could be attacked, then you're probably going to get in trouble sooner or later, right? So when you're thinking in this adversarial mindset, you think, well, who might my adversaries be? Who is there out there that hates me? Who is there out there that wants to do me harm? What would they want? And then what assets do I control that they might steal, damage, corrupt? And how much are they worth? Then you think about vulnerabilities. What are the vulnerabilities? How might they be perceived? And this is where the adversarial mindset really comes in, because if you're a nice person and an optimistic person, and you're used to things going well, you're probably going to be very bad at thinking about your vulnerabilities. But just to be very simplistic about this, you know, an unlocked door is a vulnerability, you know, in your house. Now, it may be that you live in a completely safe neighborhood and it's not going to cause any problems. So it may not be a threat. It may not be a realistic threat, but it is a vulnerability. It's an avenue through which someone might attack you.
It's better than an open door.
It could be, but maybe you want an open door too. It may be like you have lots of kids running in and out of your house, and or you know, somebody's coming over and you want to welcome them. You don't want to have to make them ring the doorbell. All kinds of things. But the point is about vulnerabilities is that they're both technical and social. So when I'm trying to encourage my students to think evil, I actually have them design a phishing method, a phishing message. They get together in a team and they develop a phish, and then they send it to me. And most of the time it's pretty obvious that this is a phish, although you'd be surprised at the sophistication and the evilness with which these students can come up with ways of tricking people. For example, one of my favorites from last year is, this was not very good to send to me. If they had sent it to other students, it would have been pretty devastating. But they copied, and this is incredibly easy to do, they copied the logo of the student financial loan support system. And you know, they said something, there's some kind of a problem with your loan. You really need to log in here, and otherwise your money's going to be cut off. So that's a big motivator for, you know, students going to school to go log in, and if they're not thinking carefully, they might fall for it. Another clever one was, how many of you take Uber or Lyft? Is that even legal here in Puerto Rico?
Yeah.
That's good to know. So you can, you know, send people. You can easily modify a map, and you can tell them that they just took this Uber ride that cost $97, And then what they're going to do, they're going to say, I didn't do that. And so then they're going to go log in to this fake Uber link, and then you're going to get their credentials, right? So I'm not trying to encourage you all to engage in this kind of criminal activity. I'm just telling you, you need to think that way. If you're starting to think that way, then you'll probably be better at protecting yourself, and you might also be better at recognizing these kinds of tricks when they come your way. So a threat is when an adversary develops an exploit that takes advantage of a vulnerability. It might be a phishing message. It might be some kind of a technical exploit in which they install malware on your system as you pass by, and it exploits some kind of highly technical vulnerability within your operating system or your application. But I'm just giving you some basic vocabulary here. And of course, not all threats are known. You can't predict all of them. In fact, the worst ones are ones that come from unpredictable sources. And so you have to have some general principles or practices that you do, like monitoring unusual activity and so on. So what kind of adversaries might you have? Actually, most popular, despite all the the images you see, it's funny, if you do an image search about cybersecurity, you'll see this generic picture of a guy in a hood at a keyboard, in a hoodie, right? Dark, no face, all kinds of zeros and ones behind him. And so there's this generic image of a computer bad guy. But in fact, it's usually an insider. That's probably about 60% of your threats are people that are in your organization who are doing bad things because they already have access, right? And there are criminals. There are organized criminals. Indeed, one of the reasons cybersecurity has become so important in the last 15 years is because it stopped being about individual script kiddies, the guy in the hoodie. It's about organized, industrialized computer crime. So the spam industry, for example, is highly organized. It could be vandals, people who just want to mess you up. Could be political opponents who want to mess you up, or to make a point, a political point. And it could be nation states. And again, we hear the most about this kind of a adversary, although it's not at all clear that those are the most important ones in terms of everyday economic costs. And it could be business competitors. It could be people trying to undermine their competition. Another thing to keep in mind is when you're talking about security, what level of society or what level of collective organization are you talking about? So the simplest, we're talking about, my computer right there, or my house. That is my in the generic sense. It could be your house or your computer too. That's the most basic level. At a higher level, we have organizational security. And of course, the stakes are much higher here because organizations control resources that go far beyond what individuals control. So if you are the famous Atlanta firm of Equifax, how many of you have heard of Equifax? So you control massive amounts of data about individuals, and if somebody breaks into you, they've hit the jackpot in terms of identity theft.
Didn't that just happen?
Didn't that just happen?
Yeah.
No, it's amazing how many breaches of this sort have happened. But yeah, Equifax is deeply embarrassed and is going to be facing class action lawsuits. And the amazing thing about it was that the vulnerability that was used, the exploit that was used was known, and they simply didn't patch in time. Now, when we talk about national security, we're talking about a different kettle of fish, because this is truly collective security at a much higher level. It means, you know, what actually is a threat to the nation state? When we talk about the Russian meddling in the 2016 election, you know, okay, it's really irritating and nasty, but to what extent does this actually constitute a threat to national security? In other words, do we really believe that the Russians are trying to take over the United States? Or do we believe that they're trying to fundamentally undermine our security and stability? I mean, that's pretty serious if that's what's happening. But there's a tendency to characterize things as truly as threats to the entire security of a country. But that's a very high bar. So be careful when you do that. You know, it might be a threat to Hillary Clinton. It might be a threat to certain forces within the government. Is it a threat to national security? That's a very high bar. And then there are global levels of threats. For example, if somebody wanted to attack the DNS as a whole, they wanted to disable all the root servers. It's not clear why anybody would want to do that unless they were some kind of a science fiction novel villain. But there have been threats. So maybe there would be some kind of massive extortion scheme in which some bad group said, you know, give us $30 billion or we will bring down the DNS. Well, I was going to run you through some specific examples here. I'll do this really quickly. I'd rather get to questions. So you can sort of classify these threats as various kinds of exploits. Some of it is just plain old cyber crime. They're trying to steal things. Some of it is cyber espionage. Some of it is cyber sabotage. And some of it might be cyber war, although there are actually no real examples of that, which is not a popular assertion to make, because a lot of people are very invested in the idea that cyber war is already happening. So the WannaCry ransomware, this is a very strange incident. Recently the US government attributed it to North Korea. It's not clear what North Korea accomplished by doing this, if they did it, but the US government seems to be convinced that North Korea did it. Because the weird thing about this was that all these people got hit by this ransomware, but nobody collected any money.
Is that the U.S. government NSA, or is that the U.S. government current White House?
It was the Department of Homeland Security actually came up with a statement.
Okay. Influenced by the White House, or not?
I don't know.
Curious.
The U.S. was claiming lots of things on North Korea before Trump was elected, though.
Yeah.
Kronos, that's a banking malware that was designed to get your bank account IDs. Essentially you can go into the darknet and you can find toolkits that link you into this Kronos malware, various variations of this Kronos malware. So they send out spam. It has a file attachment. If you link on the attachment, the malware downloads. The malware contains a Trojan, that is to say an exploit that exploits some kind of vulnerability in the operating system, and then they control your computer and they're able to read your passwords and so on. Spear phishing. This is where you take a very sophisticated design for your fish that is based on very concrete knowledge of your target. It is one sort of example of this. At the New Zealand University, the staff members were sent an email impersonating the IT department. Okay. And one of those things, this happens a lot in universities, they say, you know, you've got to log in and change your password or something like that. And then they use that access to send out, to use the university email system as a spam generator. and that then led to all kinds of bad effects. The flame virus. How many of you heard of flame? This is why so many of us have little things that cover up the cameras on our computers now, because this is probably an NSA thing that spoofed Windows updates. Okay, that's scary, isn't it? How many updates you get? You get them like once a week. And what if it's not an update actually from Microsoft? It's somebody installing a bunch of nasty things in your computer that's going to allow them to spy on you. So it activates the webcams and microphones so that they can listen in on you. Kaspersky identified it. Maybe that's one of the reasons why the DHS and NSA don't like Kaspersky very much, I don't know. And it propagates via Bluetooth or removable media. Look at the geography of the targets. It's pretty clear that it's probably a US or Israeli spying effort and espionage effort because we're looking a lot at Iran. And we all know what good friends the US and Iran are. Speaking of which, we have the famous Stuxnet worm. I'm sure you've heard about this. There's a lot of information about this. But the reason it was so interesting was because it was a cyber-physical attack, that it actually messed with a physical system, spun the centrifuges in a bad way. Now, one of the things you might have heard about cyber is that it's an asymmetrical form of conflict, that you can have a small actor can be as powerful as a big actor. Maybe that was true 10 years ago, not so much anymore. Certainly, it's less expensive for, let's say, Iran to attack the United States via cyber warfare than it is for them to try to invade the United States, or to have aircraft carriers in outside of California. That's sure true. But if you look at what it took to prepare Stuxnet, here's a rundown. They needed to set up a model environment with the necessary hardware, test their code. They had to compromise 2 digital certificates to get the malware to be signed. And then they needed to get it into the target environment, which probably required some on-the-ground spy activity, such as a contractor with access to the facility. So, we're talking about tens, maybe even hundreds of millions of dollars here in terms of developing this. So, confidentiality, integrity, availability. A distributed denial of service attack would be an attack on what? Availability, yes, correct. WikiLeaks. Confidentiality, obvious. Defacement of the US CENTCOM website by ISIS. Integrity, okay, this is too easy. Stuxnet. Integrity. OPM. Yeah, all right. Spear phishing is confidentiality. So there you go. One final issue, probably shouldn't have saved this for last because it's very controversial. Content. Is content and information security a threat?
No.
Who said no? All right, why is it no?
Because I believe in the First Amendment.
You horrible person, you. Believe in the First Amendment. All right. All right. That used to be the U.S. position.
Used to be.
That when we were arguing with Russia and China about international treaties and international norms, we said, no, content is not an information security issue because look at your framework. It doesn't affect confidentiality, availability, or integrity. Maybe you could argue integrity, but we'll get to that. But the point is, we are sort of backing away from that into the Russian and Chinese position because of the latest developments and concerns. So that's going to be an ongoing debate about information warfare, misinformation campaigns. I prefer to not call that a cybersecurity issue. I think it's a public diplomacy, propaganda, influence operations, and I don't like to call media as weapons or weaponization of media, but that's something we can talk about. Okay, I need to wrap it up, so I thank you for your attention. If there's any questions, I think we have a...
Question over there? Go ahead.
Hello, Professor. So, unlike many of my future colleagues here, I actually studied at Fashion Institute of Technology. I studied marketing.
I can't hear you, sorry.
I can try to speak louder.
Did you put the other one?